Thank you, Chris. So next up, we have a really fantastic keynote panel that we've assembled. I'm really looking forward to it. I'd like to welcome up our panelists to the stage, Elizabeth, Sara, and Joe. All right. It looks like I can't quite see the other half of the room here, so I'm going to stay up at the podium for now while we do the intro. The focus of this panel is really on a topic that we're seeing a lot more of around the U.S. and internationally, which is really a focus on district-scale smart city projects. And one of the more notable ones in recent years was SideWalk Labs and their deal with the City of Toronto for about a $10 billion district-scale smart city project. So we have with us Sara Lewis, who's the Director of Legal for SideWalk and was involved in helping to structure that public-private partnership. And she'll be talking a bit about some of what they did in approaching that project and some of the lessons learned. We also have with us Elizabeth Carter, who's the Chief Security Officer for Armored Things, a startup out of Boston focused on IoT security for district-scale projects and facilities. She'll be sharing a little bit about her background as well, which includes a stint with the City of New York, where she did a lot of work with weapons of mass destruction and preparedness for disasters and emergency preparedness as well. And then we also have with us Joe Zender, who's the chief planner for the city of Portland. And notably in Portland, we have about 5 projects that are coming online in the coming months and years that are district scale. And so Joe will be talking about some of those projects and how we think about them from a conceptual standpoint and knitting them all together as we think about the promise of smart city infrastructure related to those projects. So first up, I'd like to welcome Joe to kick it all off. So would you like to start off?
Sure.
Thanks.
From here? This is good. Well, good morning, everyone. How do I do the slides?
Oh, does Soku have the clicker? Oh, here we go.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm Joe Zender with the City of Portland, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And for those of you from out of town, welcome to Portland. This morning, we're discussing smart cities solutions and how they can be integrated into district-scale development. And this is a pretty relevant topic for us in Portland for a number of reasons. Let's see. First, we've just completed our long-range development plans, growth and development plans for the whole city and for the central city. So we have a pretty good sense now of our direction and our potential and the challenges that we face in meeting these growth targets. And we're taking action already and have a sense of momentum about our ability to get there and face these challenges. Secondly, our work in the area of smart cities field has been steadily growing. Our partnerships in doing that have been steadily broadening. And then finally, and not surprisingly, but I'm always a little surprised or reassured when this happens, is both our plans for growth and our work in smart cities share a vision where the point of view of that work for growth and development in the terms of for the plans and the use of data and technology for the smart cities work. They're successful if they succeed. They're successful if they help to improve people's lives, and particularly in underserved communities. So throughout this, we're coming at this from a humanist point of view or with a goal. So within our central city, which you're seeing an image of here, we're going to be growing, the city itself is growing by 123,000 households over the next 20 years, which in Portland scale is, that's a pretty good significant growth. 30% of that's going to be in our central city, so that's going to more than double the amount of residential development that we see in the central city, and there's a comparable amount of job growth too. So there's a lot of development and investment taking place in our central city. But one of the big ideas in this Central City 2035 plan is the Green Loop. And most simply, you would think about this as a linear park, a route that's going to link different central city destinations and districts, and to do it in a way that puts people first instead of vehicles. So the Green Loop itself, which is shown here in the line, the circuit on that map, and right now that is just a line on a map. It's a proposed or conceptual route, but it's going to be incremental in its development. As projects develop along its route, either public or private, we'll see more of the Green Loop. It's going to be adaptable and responsive in its design. It is a route, some of it's on street, some of it's new urban spaces in the central city, and it's designed so it's going to benefit each of the districts that it's part of, but also the central city as a whole. And it's a big opportunity in that it happens to link locations, a number of them, of major next generation district scale projects in the city. So we thought it would be a good frame of reference for our discussion this morning. So I just want to give you a quick tour around the Green Loop and look at a number of these districts. As I said, around that route are a combination of public and private multi-acre major urban development projects, many of which are underway, some of which are in the early stages of planning. And let's just start up in the right-hand, up in the northeast corner and go around the loop. First, I wanted to talk about the area that we're sitting in right now. It's two that intersect. One is the Rose Quarter, which is our entertainment district. We're the home of the Trailblazers and the Mona Arena, and the Lloyd District, which is just to the east of us here. As a case study, the Lloyd District is a central city neighborhood and business district that's been under public-private development for decades. It was originally started as speculative development in the 60s by a landowner. Its centerpiece is a regional mall, and we know what's happening with regional mall development now, more or less in the city. It's a chance for rethinking of a place. But it's an area, because of this public-private investment, is rich in transit. It's got light rail, it's got streetcar, it's got frequent service buses, it's got some of our best bike infrastructure. And in terms of its social infrastructure, it has strong network amongst the property owners to do collective action. It specifically, or it's exemplified by Go Lloyd, which is this Transportation Management Association. They act for the benefit of the districts. They act to advance mostly a transportation-related agenda, but also a sustainability improvement agenda. That's all private sector development anymore taking place there. The specifics of how and why smart cities approaches would benefit a value proposition for a situation like this is part of the question that I will hope we get to discuss today. The second of these is the Rose Quarter, and Rose Quarter is a classic entertainment district with a freeway. A neighborhood that was created, or a district that was created by tearing down a neighborhood and often, unfortunately, too common a story, tearing down a historically African-American neighborhood decades ago. The time has come where this relatively cut off and impacted district needs to be and can be reintegrated into the city through mixed-use development. And the difference with this one is that it's largely publicly owned, since the city owns the entertainment district around it. And so we're just now in the beginning stages of renegotiating the lease with the Trailblazers, which is sort of central to the whole business model of the place, but also looking at how to bring residential and office reinvestment into the district, and with the city lead could potentially have a serious smart cities piece of the agenda. Secondly, so we're going around clockwise around the Green Loop. The east side of the river, directly south of us here, is the Central East Side, and it's a major industrial area. It's a 21st century, though, industrial area in the fact that it's industrial because we're holding on to it, not letting it flip for residential use, and we're seeing the most solid and substantial job growth in the city in this district because we've held on to it. And down in its southern corner is the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, which has a waterfront site of 21 acres, 18 acres, and a vision for redevelopment of that land. So this is an institutional driver. The OMSI is a science museum, but it's also a member of something that's larger for both this side of the river and the other side of the river called the Innovation Quadrant. And so the Innovation Quadrant is a partnership between our Oregon Health Sciences University, Portland State University, Portland Community College, and OMSI and others, and it's got government and private sector to market, promote, develop, and program this district for really job creation purposes, but to leverage the investments in the programming and technology that you'll especially see when we talk about the OHSU side of the equation. OMSI's developing their site to take advantage of that. OMSI's developing their site, offering their site for development to diversify the district, to make it more of a place, and to advance the mission of OMSI, which is a technology-based mission. Once again, this is in the early stages. They have a very well thought out master plan by Snøhetta Architects. It's got a very solid program for sustainability and energy conservation kind of measures built into the development programming. The smart cities component may be a bit underdeveloped at this point. Next, across the river. So this bridge, the green line, the Tillamook crossing that is down in the corner, is the same bridge that runs past OMSI on the other side. These are directly across the river from each other. And that bridge, that green line, is a light rail bike ped bridge only, a brand new connection and that physically is linking the two sides of this river that programmatically the Innovation Quadrant is really trying to deliver on. And so the western side is the OHSU Schnitzer campus. It's about 19-20 acres, major redevelopment site, home of the Joint Sciences education building between those different universities that are in the Innovation Quadrant, as well as a basic research tower recently constructed, and the Night Cancer Research Center under construction. And there's still many buildings and many, ultimately it's going to have over 1.6 million square feet of this kind of research use. So this is a medical science campus. This is being developed by the Oregon OHSU. And so the issue here is the use case, the users there very much are science, data, technology-driven uses. The way capital is raised for a development like this is through the Oregon University system. So OHSU, in building this ambitious plan, is regularly subject to the limitations in the timing and the parsimony that our public capital sources have. So whereas there's a mission, the capital doesn't quite align. Finally, I just want to talk real quickly about the Broadway corridor, because this is the one that possibly has the best case for us to be thought of as a district level smart cities project. This is the former downtown post office. It's owned by the city now. It's a 14-acre site in a 32-acre area that the city has just offered for master planning and potential master development to a partner selected through a very public process, Continuum Partners out of Denver, who did the Denver Union Station project. It's going to have 3.8 million square feet of development potential on the site. That's 2,400 units, 4,000 jobs. That's a lot of development. But one of the basic things that's different about this particular urban renewal project is its intention to put people first. And so this one is very much driven by these values of accomplishing equity in the costs and the benefits that come with really just a big, high-density urban redevelopment project. And its specific measures of success that it's even defined by it for itself are shown on this slide. And so when you think of data and technology and metrics and the use of those to help measure the success of a development, This is a different kind of set of metrics than we often are talking about. So one of the interesting smart cities challenges is how to bring the two together. We're very interested in being a lab for the success or a lab to learn from the policy innovations that we do here in Portland. Smart cities is going to be a way that we are able to track and learn from that. So thank you.
Great. Next up, we have Sara.
Hi, everyone. As Skip said, I'm Sara Lewis. I'm the legal director at SideWalk Labs. As my title implies, I am a lawyer, so apologies for that. But I thought it might be interesting to draw a little bit on my experience in negotiating our project with Waterfront Toronto and some of the trends we see in innovating on public-private partnerships. So before I start, let me give just a quick background on SideWalk Labs for those of you who weren't familiar. So we were founded in 2015 by Google's Larry Page and our CEO, Dan Doctoroff. So we're a subsidiary of Alphabet and a sister company to Google. And we were essentially charged with the task of answering the question, what would a city look like if you started from scratch, from first principles, sort of tabula rasa, in thinking about what a city should look like in the digital age? And so in thinking about how to answer that question, coming from sort of an Alphabet Google environment, we do very much believe in the potential for technology to improve quality of life and address cities' biggest challenges, but not in tech for tech's sake. So it's all with sort of an underlying purpose of improving urban quality of life. And essentially the way that SideWalk thinks about city building is this construct of the city as a platform. And so we conceive of a city as a number of physical layers, and on top of it is an overarching digital layer. And the idea is that the digital layer is essentially sort of this cross-cutting backbone that connects each piece of the physical layer and is sort of built into the physical aspects of the city from the very beginning. And in this way, SideWalk hopes that the integration of all these, the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. So sometimes you hear SideWalk Labs saying that we're trying to bridge the urbanist-technologist divide, which is sort of another way of saying the same thing, which is that we see the future of city building really bringing together the physical and the digital, the urban planners and the engineers to, in sort of a thoughtful melding together. So I want to talk briefly about the project in Toronto before I talk more about the partnership. So as Skip said, this is quite a large district-scale smart cities project. SideWalk Labs had been looking for sort of a place to demonstrate the potential of the way that it conceives of cities. And so at the same time we were looking for that place, Waterfront Toronto had out an RFP looking for a partner. And the two of us came together on a project. Waterfront Toronto has planning and development authority over an approximately 880-acre site in Toronto's eastern waterfront, which you can see here. We think Toronto is a really exceptional place for the project for a number of reasons, the tech community there, the diversity of the place. But you can sort of see here, it's a pretty underdeveloped area of land. There's a lot of potential. It's in desperate need of enabling infrastructure. And it's also very, very close to Toronto's existing downtown core. So we think it's really ripe for potential. And there you can see, I think, just how large it is, particularly relative to their current downtown. So going back to the way that SideWalk thinks about cities, bringing together the physical and the digital, this is sort of the way that we've approached public-private partnerships in our partnership with Waterfront Toronto as well. So that negotiation is still underway, so I don't want to talk too specifically about it. But just as SideWalk thinks that the melding of physical and digital is fundamental to city building, we also think it's fundamental to public-private partnerships in the direction that they're headed. So historically, and I recognize there's no accepted definition of public-private partnership, it's ranged on a continuum, everything from, on the one hand, something that looks like the city just sort of contracting with a private sector party, to something much more robust and fulsome. Traditionally, in any case, it's really focused on physical infrastructure. In some cases, physical horizontal infrastructure, in other cases, some vertical development, but something sort of tangible, like a road, a bridge, a building, that sort of thing. And we think it's really critical to bring in digital infrastructure as part of that. And to the point about sort of melding the two in a way that where the digital touches the physical layers in all respects. And I think one of the things that's so exciting and frankly complex about this is its potential to really expand the scope and size of public-private partnerships, and I think to some extent also their impact. Because you can imagine, again, sort of going to the traditional model where you see physical infrastructure, it's sort of necessarily geographically limited. Even if it's a quite broad geography, you can sort of put your hands on where it is, and it's often more for a singular type of purpose. So, building a road in a particular place and for a particular purpose. And when you bring digital infrastructure into the mix, I think you have much broader potential implications. You have all sorts of use cases for the same type of digital technology, and it can touch upon all sorts of different physical pieces of the puzzle. So just as one example, and something SideWalk has been thinking about, you can sort of imagine a resident engagement application that focuses on a digital solution to verifying identity. And you could sort of imagine that, instead of carrying around a driver's license and a passport and a bunch of passwords that no one can remember to a bunch of different applications, there could be some sort of solution that more easily verified your identity. And if you go to the DMV, if you go to the library, if you go to a bar and need to show that you're 21, if you go to an airport and need to verify that you're a US citizen, it could all be done much more seamlessly. And so just in that example alone, you could imagine the large scope that project could have and the number of different physical pieces it could touch on. And so one of the things that SideWalk is really thinking about is how to bring that to a city and a large-scale district project like the one in Toronto, and all of the implications that has for our working with Waterfront Toronto. I think one of the exciting things about this, and probably one of the things that worries people a little bit, is that it does suggest a large project with the government, and potentially you could imagine the private sector party taking on a larger role, because it has traditionally been assumed that they bring technological solutions more so than the public sector. Although I think what we're seeing is that these partnerships will necessarily evolve to keep up. So the governments will find ways to recognize the integration of the private sector role in more areas. So you might see, for example, rather than the private sector bringing something to contribute to the building phase of a project, and potentially the financing phase of a project, they may also have a role in the design and planning up front, maybe even the ongoing maintenance. But I fully anticipate that the governments will find ways to set standards. Certainly, data governance and privacy is a huge issue, one that SideWalk's very committed to, but that could be something governments oversee and play a really important role in. Procurement standards, all sorts of oversight and supervision of that sort of thing. And I also think one of the things we're seeing as these projects grow more complex and with more digital integration is the involvement of more parties in them. So Waterfront Toronto is actually especially unique. It brings together all three levels of the federal, the Canadian government, so the federal, the province, and the city. And that's a really useful sort of convening entity in that regard. But I think you can also imagine not just different levels of government, but different agencies, potentially even bringing in like NGOs, the academic institutions, that sort of thing, as these partnerships grow even more complex. And so I'll leave you with that, but I think that this is a really ripe area for innovation in the form of the partnerships themselves. And I think it'll be interesting to see what they end up looking like when cities, essentially, smart cities, just become known as cities.
Thank you, Sara. So Sara made a great point, which was this convergence that we're seeing between the physical and the digital. And so that obviously poses some challenges for planners that are thinking about long-term investments and large-scale projects. And it also poses some challenges when it comes to security. And so I think that's a nice segue as we talk about sort of the physical meets the cybersecurity realm. So Elizabeth, would you like to maybe talk a little bit about your background and then also share some of your latest thinking on how cybersecurity plays a role when it comes to IoT infrastructure?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks, Skip. Can you guys hear me? I think this was meant for somebody taller than me. My name is Elizabeth Carter. I'm the Chief Security Officer of Armored Things, which is a small startup focusing on IoT, specifically on the physical meet cybersecurity realm. Prior to that, I worked for Apple. I was the head of crisis management for the Americas for about 2 years, working out of Cupertino and dealing with all kinds of issues that could come up. Prior to that, I worked for the Chertoff Group for 5 years. I worked with Mark Weatherford, who was a wonderful colleague. And before that, as Skip mentioned, I worked for the City of New York doing disaster planning, specifically focused on WMD prep. I wanted to talk a little bit today, and I'll keep my remarks rather brief because I feel that the speakers earlier did a wonderful job covering the security aspects of what we're worried about when it comes to smart cities. But I think that right now we have an opportunity to really support innovation, but unfortunately we're hampered by the risks that we face that kind of threaten our security in these cities and our security as we develop smart city innovations. As technology professionals, I know you all know that the principal risk we all face is our failure to adequately address and manage risk or prepared for unintended consequences. And I want to address the risk and the opportunity to welcome the new technology in the way that we can build resiliency across our cities and also deal with a new host of threats that we're facing, which is obviously the cyber and physical ones you all know well, but now looking at those two things combined, whether or not we have to deal with the cyber and physical risk combined, and what does that actually mean, and how do we actually prepare for something like that? So defining risk in today's cities, we have a lot of, I just put up some stats up here that I thought were kind of interesting. We're dealing now with over 50% of the world's population living in cities. We're going to get to 70% of the global population in cities by 2050. We're looking at all kinds of threats, dealing with that population move, cyber attacks, natural threats. We need to actually move toward a more holistic way of managing risk. And as I was mentioning, changing times. We're dealing with movement of people. As I just mentioned, 50% of people now live in cities, 70% by 2050. The use of technology, obviously, is creating more efficiencies and is making our lives easier, but at the same time is opening us up to more risks. And then the Internet of Things is something I want to address as well, because it's actually a wonderful, promising area, but it also does open us up to additional risks. In terms of risk, we've spent a lot of time in recent years planning for and responding to risks posed by natural disasters. And I know I responded to a couple of major hurricanes just last year that hit our soil and really affected several major cities in the US. And then we've also dealt with terrorism incidents, and those continue to come along. We dealt with one just last year in New York with a vehicle ramming. Now we have cyber attacks. They're continuing to pose a significant challenge for all of us, as we all know well. And as cities become more interconnected, we have to really start thinking about planning, and that's what I used to do for New York and do WMD planning, which is what I was focused on. But we also did cyber planning, and we were one of the few cities to actually have a cybersecurity plan in place. A lot of cities don't, actually, and they still don't. And when I worked for the city back in 2010, we were one of the first to actually develop one, and it's shocking to me now, looking at 8 years later, that so many cities and municipalities still lack a cybersecurity plan. So I want to talk a little bit about, actually I'll take a minute just to talk a little bit about IoT. And from physical, exercise tracker type devices to access management portals to critical infrastructure applications, we're seeing a huge boom in this market. We need to protect this information that these devices are collecting and transmitting, and they're collecting a huge amount of data. That's what we're doing right now. And that's the value that they add as well, is the data they collect. But if we can't keep that data safe, it doesn't really make sense to collect it in the first place. And we have to be mindful of the impact on privacy too. A lot of the questions that I get in various places that I go and people that I meet with is, how are you making sure that we keep people's personal information private and we're not touching too much on people's personal privacy? It's a question we got in New York a lot. We were one of the first to roll out a major district-wide public-private partnership dealing with smart city technology. It was called the Lower Manhattan Security Initiative. A lot of you may be familiar with it. It's still going strong. They keep it out of the press, though, because of the concerns about privacy for the most part. It was started in 2005 with funds that came out of the 9/11 disaster and is continuing to add value. We have tons of cameras. I want to say it's like 3,000 cameras and other technology, and including sensors, including license plate readers, and including video analytics. So with those types of developments, we have to be concerned about people's privacy. So in terms of preparing a smart city to thrive and mitigate risk, we have to really examine and understand our threat landscape as we're dealing with it. We have to spend that time and resource to put appropriate response plans in place, as I mentioned before, and also ensure the right personnel are in place to respond in the event of an incident. What we can do is, and I was talking about physical security meets cybersecurity, roll out some use of technology. Obviously, there's also this IoT case for emergency response, which is something I've been working on, which is super interesting, because if we have all these devices already in place in the environment, whether they be sensors, whether they be communication devices, whether they be pretty much anything that we've been rolling out in terms of collecting that data, we can also use those to respond in an emergency. We can use those to communicate to the populace. We can use those to make sure that we respond adequately and get the information out and start shutting things down, or start sending messaging out, or start flashing lights or letting people know there's something going on. So this is also an interesting new area that had some promise. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Basically, as we embark on this next era of innovation, we have this ability now to not only build really smart cities, but build secure cities, and I think that's our real opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth, I was wondering if you could give a specific example of, something that kind of went awry with regard to disaster planning and preparedness, and, a key takeaway.
Absolutely, of course. So I think that if we look at the main one on all of our minds would be 9/11. I mean, if you look back at what happened with the 9/11 Commission, they cataloged all the ways that we missed the cues. We missed the warning signs. Even if you look at another type of disaster, a little bit different, which would have been the financial crisis of 2008, that was being predicted back in the 90s, where people were saying, something's going to happen here. We have a financial bubble. Not enough attention is being paid to credit risk. So because we're not paying attention to these types of cues, we end up spending an inordinate amount of resources responding to these types of events, as opposed to preparing for them and then potentially even having the opportunity to mitigate them or avoid them altogether. So the investment in actually preparing for these risks is hugely beneficial in the long run, and it really helps to eliminate this huge spend in resources, personnel, and money to respond to something that you weren't expecting or prepared for.
Great. And Joe, a specific question about the Broadway corridor. It's one of the larger projects, in the queue, so to speak. What are some of the smart city applications that you see out there that might be most relevant to that district? You mentioned it does have some promise from a smart city standpoint.
Well, It's interesting just to hear the discussions even so far today. It's given me a lot of thoughts about this. The systems we're building into a big district like that are value propositions for the developers and owners and the operators of the offices and the residences that are going to be in the district. So there's a lot about energy systems. There's a lot about building performance. You would think we're moving into more thinking about transportation and how it plays out at a district scale with AVs and EVs coming in. We're really trying to design the district to improve our performance in terms of reducing carbon, consumption of carbon, and to move other metrics to the extent that these proprietarial kind of sensors and meters that the business and the property owners would want to use for the operation of their building can be done in a way that also produces district level data so that we all could learn from the combination of policies and investments and designs and how that affects our ability to perform. It's really going to inform us all more about our ability to meet our, for instance in Portland, our carbon reduction goals. We have a lot of cases of an individual building, how it performs. We have a lot of policies, but we don't actually have the ability to watch a district, track how it performs. And it just strikes me as there's a great opportunity, especially where that metering is providing a business benefit to the owners of the property, and if we make it secure. You've convinced me.
So Sara, when I worked for the city of Portland a number of years ago, we were constantly beating the drum of city as platform. Like, don't try and reinvent the wheel or recreate what the private sector is already doing, but think of how we work in tandem. How would you break down sort of the notion of city as platform?
Sure. So as I mentioned, SideWalk sees the different layers of the city. We actually refer to them internally as pillars. I don't know where that came from or why, but it's caught on. In sort of taking them each at a time, we have a lot of sort of exciting ideas, or we think they're exciting. So at the sustainable infrastructure level, it's really about sustainability, and we hope to get to climate positivity at some point. Which is an ambitious goal. But some of the things we're thinking about there, for example, one of the things we're really interested in, and it kind of meshes with our buildings pillar as well, but sort of an integrated infrastructure building management system. So you can imagine collecting data and in a privacy preserving way, in getting to a system that knows, for example, when everyone's out of the office, that it can not have the AC on full blast, or even you can press a button to run the dishwasher and it will sort of know when demand is lower and run it at a more efficient time. So that's one of the things we're looking at there. Going to the next layer, the public realm. There we see sort of this vibrant, reservable, programmable, very flexible space. And one of the things we're looking at, for example, is weather mitigation techniques, adaptable streets, those sorts of things. The transportation mobility layer is one we're very excited about. We think the key innovation here is autonomous vehicles. It's something that everyone thinks and agrees is coming. It's just a matter of when. And thinking about how that affects the entire landscape around it, including streets, buildings, and the like. The building layer, there we think about the goal is really being adaptable, flexible, more efficient buildings, and in particular trying to find technological innovations that reduce construction costs and can actually lead to greater affordable housing. We also have a pillar, a layer known as community, which we count in the physical layers, but probably isn't. And there we think about this as sort of fostering sort of a close-knit community with better access to daily services. So, for example, the identity type system I was mentioning earlier, you could imagine a much more seamless, convenient way to get public services. And then finally, the digital layer, which, as I mentioned, is almost like a city operating system. And in there, I want to emphasize, we sort of see this, because it's so cross-cutting, as something we facilitate, almost like a master enabler. But we would envision, not providing all the tech solutions ourselves. We're not building Google City, for example. But rather sort of providing an open platform with well-supported APIs that third parties could innovate on over time. And in that way, I think make the city very adaptable and flexible as things change as well.
Great. Joe, one quick question. With respect to some of the sustainability objectives with some of the district scale developments, we've got things like the Innovation Quadrant in Portland that encapsulate several of these development opportunities. There's eco districts, which is doing work globally, thinking about sustainability at the district scale and all the systems and how they interrelate. How are you looking at these district scale opportunities and sustainability goals, which Portland's well known for, and where do you see smart cities fitting into that?
One thing that we've learned through all that other district level work on pursuing sustainability is the importance of governance and, for lack of a better term, model design. What it is that you're actually tracking, what it is that you're actually using for your measures of success, and the agreement about those and how they affect design, development, and use. So now for Broadway Corridor, it's a public-private partnership, and it's a classic one at this point, where it's mostly about the infrastructure, but we want to take it to something more than that. And it's really interesting to think through the business case for the private sector side and which parts of this align with trying to accomplish something at a district scale. And it may just be how we're differently using the information that's being produced. So.
Great. And Elizabeth, what's one example of a smart city project that you're particularly excited about that you may have come across recently?
So I haven't worked on any lately. Obviously, I just mentioned the New York one way back when, but I know that I've looked on from a distance with some admiration of what San Diego has been doing, integrating security into their smart city infrastructure. I know they have automated transportation systems, LED street lighting, traffic control, public transportation technology, but they've also invested in an enterprise-wide vulnerability management platform to inventory all their systems and identify all their risks and implement a continuous security monitoring. So I think they've done a really nice job of that, and it's definitely a good example.
Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I want to say thank you to our panelists. This has been a great discussion. Thank you. And big round of applause